The message came in while I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, watching a risk map scroll across a screen. Red zones, yellow zones, silent threats that only mattered if you noticed them in time. My phone buzzed once. Then again. My wife, Claire, had texted, 8 days to decide if I keep you. No emojis. No explanation. Just a deadline, framed like a campaign launch. Around me, people kept talking. Supply chains, breach simulations, contingency planning. I didn't move. I didn't react. I didn't even open the message right away. I let it sit there, glowing faintly against the table, like a test I'd already passed without answering. That evening, we were at a rooftop event she insisted we attend. A wellness brand mixer. Soft lighting, expensive smiles, drinks named after feelings. Claire moved through the crowd like she belonged to it more than she belonged to me. Her hand brushed my arm once, absent, like checking an accessory. There was a man standing too close to her. Tall. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from money that doesn't ask permission. I recognized him from her stories, though she'd never mentioned him by name. A private investor. Someone who believed in her vision. Someone who could make things happen fast. He leaned in while she spoke. She laughed in a way she didn't at home. Her phone was in her hand, screen lighting up again and again. Notifications. Applause without clapping. Someone nearby made a comment about how well Claire was doing lately. About momentum. About how she'd finally outgrown certain limitations. No one said my name. Later, while she was across the room, her phone lit up on the table beside me. A preview flashed before the screen dimmed. A short message. Familiar tone. Casual ownership. Tomorrow we finalize. I'll handle the rest. She came back smiling, energized, already somewhere else. She mentioned deadlines. Pressure. Big decisions. She said the next 8 days would be important for both of us. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her who paid the mortgage or who had been there before any of this mattered. That night, she fell asleep quickly, phone face down on the nightstand. I lay awake, already treating the deadline like an external threat. And like every threat I'd ever handled, I started planning from day one. By the next morning, the deadline was already doing its job. Claire moved through the apartment with a sharpened focus, phone pressed to her ear, voice low but confident. She spoke about meetings, alignment, leverage. She didn't look at me when she said my name, and when she did, it sounded like an afterthought built into a calendar invite. I left early, not in a dramatic way. No slammed doors. I just took my laptop and walked out while she was still talking to someone who wasn't me. At work, deadlines were real things. They were tools, not threats. People who used them poorly usually ended up exposed. I sat at my desk and watched internal alerts scroll in. Access logs. Authentication requests. Patterns. The kind of information most people never noticed until it was too late. Around midday, my phone lit up again. Another message from Claire. She wrote that she needed clarity. That this was about growth. About choosing the future wisely. She didn't ask how I felt. She reminded me how little time there was. I didn't reply. Instead, I noticed a name appear twice in her shared cloud activity. Same document. Same edits. Different location. The investor. The one from the rooftop. He wasn't just advising. He was embedded. Comments. Suggestions. Strategy phrased like intimacy. That afternoon, a colleague stopped by my desk. Someone I trusted. He asked, casually, how things were going at home. He'd seen Claire at a private event recently. Said she looked confident. Surrounded. Like someone already celebrating a win. He didn't mean anything by it. But it landed clean. That evening, Claire came home late. Energized. She talked about opportunities without mentioning who created them. She said the next week would be intense. That she hoped I could be supportive. She said pressure revealed character. I listened. I nodded. I cleared the dishes while she scrolled through messages that made her smile. Later, when she showered, her phone vibrated again on the counter. This time I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The notification preview was enough. Another confirmation. Another quiet overlap between business and something closer. Before bed, she mentioned the deadline again. She framed it as fairness. As a chance. As something generous. I said nothing. When the lights went out, she turned away from me, already exhausted from managing multiple futures. I stayed still, eyes open, mentally mapping exits. Not emotional ones. Operational ones. By the end of the first day, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was already stepping out of the system that thought it could pressure me. By the second day, the apartment felt staged. Claire moved objects without noticing where they landed, like someone already practicing absence. Her attention stayed glued to her screen. Notifications came in waves. She smiled at some, tightened at others. Every reaction was quiet, controlled, curated. I left after she did. Different timing. Same silence. At work, I didn't look distracted. I never do. I sat in front of my monitors and let the system breathe. Shared accounts. Legacy access. Devices that still trusted me because no one had thought to revoke anything yet. Not because she was careless, but because she assumed the deadline kept me in place. Late morning, I opened our joint cloud storage. Years of shared life reduced to folders and timestamps. I wasn't searching emotionally. I was tracing overlap. Names, IPs, version histories. It didn't take long. There were documents she'd never mentioned. Pitch decks labeled confidential. Calendars synced to locations she'd said were client dinners. Expense notes vague enough to sound professional, specific enough to tell a different story if you knew how to read them. Transfers routed through accounts I recognized from earlier conversations about career acceleration. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't download. I didn't need trophies. I just confirmed what I already felt the night before. Around noon, another message came in from Claire. Shorter this time. Sharper. She said the silence was making her nervous. She asked if I was even taking the deadline seriously. I let the phone sit face down. In the afternoon, a systems alert popped up. An external device had tried to access a shared folder tied to our home network. It failed once. Then tried again. The location matched the investor's office district. Not proof of anything illegal. Just proximity. Just patterns. That evening, Claire came home distracted, energy vibrating under her skin. She talked about a meeting that went really well. She said people were finally seeing her value. She mentioned the investor by first name this time, as if that made it more transparent. She asked where I'd been all day. I said work. It was the truth. Later, while she was asleep, I sat at the edge of the bed and watched her phone light up again. This time I turned my own phone on. I exited our shared messaging threads, muted family groups, left collaboration spaces we'd built together over years. One by one, without noise. I didn't block her. I didn't confront her. I just started removing myself from systems she assumed were permanent. By the end of the second day, I wasn't collecting evidence. I was closing doors quietly, while she was still counting down, believing the clock belonged to her. By the third morning, the deadline had started to leak. Not into me, but into her. Claire checked her phone before she brushed her teeth, then again before she spoke. She moved faster, like urgency could be manufactured if repeated often enough. I was already gone when she noticed. Not physically. The apartment was still intact. The coffee machine worked. My jacket still hung where it always had. But the digital noise she relied on had thinned. Fewer confirmations. Fewer instant responses. The shared calendar stopped updating. A project folder she needed access to returned an error message. At work, I requested a temporary remote assignment under the pretense of a system audit. No questions were asked. People like me don't usually lie about reasons. We don't have to. By midday, her messages shifted tone. Less confident. More frequent. She asked if something was wrong. She said the silence felt passive-aggressive. She said deadlines required engagement. I didn't respond. Instead, I initiated the first full cut. I transferred my salary to a new account she didn't have visibility into. I rerouted subscriptions tied to my credentials. Cloud storage, utilities, services she'd never thought about because they'd always worked quietly in the background. That afternoon, an email notification hit her inbox. A routine security update from a platform she used daily. It informed her that an administrator had changed. The name attached wasn't mine anymore. She called. I let it ring. When she came home early, the apartment felt unfamiliar to her. Not empty, but unanchored. She stood in the doorway longer than usual, scanning for something to argue with. There was nothing obvious. No suitcase. No note. No scene waiting to happen. She asked where I was. The question carried more tension than curiosity. I said I was out. She followed me from room to room with explanations she didn't ask for. She talked about pressure, about opportunity, about how this week mattered. She said the investor was expecting clarity too, that everyone involved needed assurance. I listened without reacting. I didn't mirror her urgency. I didn't reassure her. Later that night, she sat on the bed scrolling, refreshing feeds that no longer gave her the same sense of control. I noticed her checking shared apps, then checking again, like maybe the system would correct itself if she waited long enough. It didn't. By the end of the third day, I hadn't disappeared dramatically, but the infrastructure that kept her steady had begun to fail quietly. And for the first time, the deadline felt like it was counting down on her side instead of mine. By the fourth day, Claire stopped pretending the deadline was calm. The pressure had moved into her posture. She spoke faster, listened less. Every notification pulled her attention like a string. She kept checking systems that had always obeyed her without delay, as if repetition alone could restore authority. I stayed away longer than usual, not to punish her, but because distance had become efficient. From a temporary workspace downtown, I watched activity logs update in real time. Attempts to regain access. Password resets requested, then canceled. Small signs of confusion spreading outward. Midday, I noticed movement tied to the investor's network again. Not direct, never reckless, but close enough to reveal reliance. Files syncing, calendars adjusting. He wasn't just supporting her rise. He was shaping it. Deadlines, leverage, urgency. The same language she'd started using at home. That afternoon, she sent a longer message. She framed it as concern. Said she didn't recognize me lately. Said silence wasn't fair. She reminded me, again, that there were only days left. I read it once and closed the app. Instead, I finalized a quiet transfer. Legal, clean, anticipated long before this week ever existed. Documents moved to a private vault. A consultation scheduled under a neutral name. Nothing dramatic. Just structure forming where emotion used to live. When I came home that evening, Claire was waiting. Not angry yet. Focused. She spoke carefully, like someone negotiating terms she believed she still controlled. She mentioned the investor openly now, framed as a necessity. She said this was how things worked at her level. She said deadlines separated serious people from the rest. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge the logic. I let her speak until the room felt full of words that didn't require my participation. Later, she tried a different angle. Warmth. Memory. She referenced trips we'd taken, risks we'd shared. She asked if I was really willing to throw that away over silence. I watched her carefully then, not as my wife, but as someone managing optics under pressure. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing control of the timeline she'd designed. That night, her phone rang more than usual. She stepped into another room to answer. When she came back, her confidence was thinner. The investor needed clarity too. Things were moving fast. Decisions couldn't wait forever. I nodded once and went to bed. By the end of the fourth day, the structure around her began to tighten. Not from confrontation, but from absence. She had built her power on urgency. I was dismantling it by refusing to move at her speed. By the fifth day, the deadline stopped being something Claire announced and started being something she defended. She talked about it the way people talk about deadlines when they're afraid they might miss them. With justification. With explanations layered over urgency. I could see it in the data before I saw it at home. Her activity had changed. More late-night logins. More cross-checking. She was looping through the same systems, looking for confirmation that things were still where she left them. They weren't. That morning, a notification went out to a small circle around her. Not dramatic. Just procedural. A calendar update she didn't authorize. A meeting rescheduled without her input. The kind of thing that makes people pause before they speak. By afternoon, the pause had spread. I heard about it indirectly. A colleague mentioned Claire's name in passing, asked if she was still leading a certain initiative. The question wasn't aggressive. It was cautious. The kind of caution that appears when confidence starts to fracture. When I came home that evening, Claire was already there. Sitting still. Phone in her hand, screen dark. She looked up as I entered, searching my face for something she could react to. I gave her nothing. She started explaining again, this time slower. She said people were asking questions. She said things felt unstable. She said she needed to know where I stood because others were watching. She didn't say who the others were. She didn't have to. Later, while she was in the shower, her phone lit up on the counter. A single-line preview appeared. Short. Impatient. The investor was asking for certainty. He wasn't used to delays. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The message told me everything. His leverage depended on her ability to deliver control, and that control was slipping. That night, Claire didn't turn away when we went to bed. She stayed still, like proximity might reset something. She mentioned the deadline one last time before sleep, framed now as a mutual decision. Something we could align on, together. I didn't answer. The next morning, I wasn't there when she woke up. Not because I'd left permanently, but because I'd removed myself from the rhythm she depended on. No shared routine. No predictable presence. By the end of the 5th day, the social layer around her had shifted, not with confrontation, but with distance. People stopped filling in the gaps for her. She had always controlled rooms by setting timelines. Now the rooms were quiet, and quiet doesn't negotiate. By the 6th day, Claire's confidence had thinned into something brittle. She still dressed the same, still spoke the language of momentum, but the timing was off. She reacted instead of directing. Every movement felt slightly late, like she was arriving after decisions had already been made without her. I noticed it when I passed her at an industry event that evening. Not together, not announced. We occupied the same space like strangers who shared history no one else could see. She stood in a tight circle of people who nodded more than they spoke. Their attention drifted easily. They checked phones. They scanned the room. The investor was there too. He stayed close, but not protective. He spoke quietly, leaned in, then stepped back. The distance between them was new, calculated. He wasn't anchoring her anymore. He was measuring her. Someone nearby asked a neutral question about timelines, about deliverables, about whether everything was still on track. Claire answered smoothly, but the words didn't land the way they used to. The circle loosened. A few people excused themselves. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. My absence was already doing the work. Later that night, she came home restless. She moved through the apartment without direction, touching things that no longer felt like leverage. She said the atmosphere out there was strange, that people were acting differently. She said she felt like she was being evaluated instead of supported. She waited for reassurance. I stayed neutral. Her phone kept lighting up, then going dark again. Messages half-read. Calls unanswered. The investor wasn't pushing anymore. He was waiting, and waiting was something she wasn't good at. She asked if I was angry, not apologetic, curious, like anger was a resource she could still negotiate with. I said nothing. She sat down across from me and talked about pressure again, but the tone had shifted. Less authority, more exposure. She said she needed stability. She said she didn't like feeling alone in rooms that used to open for her. I watched her carefully. She wasn't collapsing. She was recalibrating, trying to find where the control had gone. That night, she didn't sleep. I could tell by the way she checked her phone in the dark, brightness turned low, like she didn't want the screen to betray her. By morning, she looked tired in a way ambition doesn't fix. By the end of the 6th day, the isolation had settled in. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet realization that the systems she relied on no longer bent toward her, and that the one person who had always absorbed the pressure for her wasn't doing it anymore. By the 7th day, Claire stopped managing impressions and started managing damage. The shift was subtle but visible. She canceled plans she'd been talking about for weeks. She stayed home longer, phone always in her hand, waiting instead of directing. The deadline no longer sounded like a strategy. It sounded like a lifeline. I came back later that evening than usual. She was already sitting at the kitchen table, lights on, laptop closed in front of her like a prop she didn't need anymore. She looked up when I entered, relief crossing her face before she could stop it. She asked if we could talk. Not with authority this time. With restraint. She spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they realize they might not be heard. She said things had become complicated, that expectations were shifting, that people were asking questions she didn't like answering alone. She said the investor was pressuring her for clarity and that uncertainty made everyone nervous. She paused, watching me for a reaction. I gave her none. She tried again, reframing the deadline as a misunderstanding. She said she hadn't meant it as a threat. She said she needed reassurance and didn't know how else to get it. She said this week had exposed how fragile things really were. I listened without interrupting. I didn't correct her timeline. I didn't remind her of the message that started all of this. I let her words hang in the space between us. She asked where I stood now, not where I would stand in 8 days. Now, I didn't answer right away. I stood up, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The silence stretched longer than she expected, long enough for her to shift in her chair. She finally said she felt like she was losing control. Not of me, of everything. She said rooms felt colder, people less responsive, the investor less patient. She said she hadn't realized how much stability I provided until it was gone. That was the first honest sentence she'd said all week. I told her I wasn't making decisions under pressure anymore. Not hers. Not anyone's. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain further. She asked what that meant for us. I said nothing. That night, she slept lightly, waking often, checking her phone like it might deliver absolution. It didn't. By morning, the deadline had lost its teeth. It no longer dictated anything. By the end of the 7th day, she wasn't confronting me. She was confronting the absence of leverage. And for the first time, she understood that whatever choice came next would not be on her timeline. By the 8th day, the collapse didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with delays. Claire waited for calls that didn't come. She refreshed feeds that stayed unchanged. She dressed carefully in the morning, then changed twice, then sat down without leaving. The investor stopped pressing. That was the first real signal. He didn't argue or escalate. He recalculated. The tone of his messages shifted from expectation to distance. Shorter replies, longer gaps. He had options. And once uncertainty appeared around her, his interest followed the cleanest exit. That afternoon, she finally admitted something without framing it. She said the deal was stalling. Not because of numbers, but because confidence had evaporated. She said people sensed instability. She said no one wanted to attach themselves to a situation that felt unresolved. She didn't blame me. She didn't apologize either. She just stated it like a loss report. Later, I watched her sit alone on the couch, scrolling through old photos she hadn't touched in years. Not for sentiment, for orientation. Like she was trying to remember when things had last felt solid, when the ground hadn't shifted under every step. The apartment felt larger that evening, empty in a way furniture can't fix. She moved through rooms slowly, touching familiar surfaces like they might respond differently this time. Her phone buzzed once. She checked it immediately, then set it down without reading further. Whatever it said, it wasn't what she needed. She asked if I was leaving. Not dramatically, quietly, like someone asking about whether they can already feel changing. I told her I'd already left the structure that made this possible. The deadlines, the leverage, the silence built to force reactions. I said I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to win. I just wasn't available for games that required me to shrink. She nodded, absorbing it piece by piece. That night, she didn't sleep at all. I could tell by the way she sat at the edge of the bed when morning came, phone in her hand, unread messages stacked like evidence she didn't know how to present. By then, the deadline had expired on its own. Not because a decision was made, but because it no longer mattered. She had lost the investor's momentum. She had lost the room's attention. And she had lost the ability to dictate terms. By the end of the 8th day, her world hadn't exploded. It had simply gone quiet in the places where power used to answer her. And silence, once it turns on you, doesn't negotiate back. By the 9th morning, nothing needed to be said anymore. The deadline had passed quietly, like a meeting no one showed up for. Claire moved through the apartment slower now, careful with her movements, as if sudden gestures might break something that was already cracked. She didn't bring up the investor again. She didn't need to. The absence had explained everything. His messages had stopped entirely. No pressure, no reassurance. Just the clean silence of someone who had recalculated and moved on. That afternoon, she finally asked the question she'd been circling for days. Not about the deadline. Not about the deal. About me. She asked where I was going. I told her I wasn't leaving in a dramatic way. I was already gone in every way that mattered. I said I'd separated what needed separating. Accounts, access, obligations. I said there was no urgency anymore, because nothing was being negotiated. She listened without interrupting. No arguments. No conditions. The room felt neutral, like it had returned to its original state after a long malfunction. She said she hadn't realized how much of her stability had been borrowed. Not just from me, but from the structure around us. She said she thought control meant setting timelines. She said she understood now that it only worked if the other person accepted them. I didn't respond. There was nothing to clarify. She stood there for a moment, then asked if there was any chance left. Not framed as an ultimatum. Not framed as leverage. Just a question, exposed and unprotected. I told her that whatever came next wouldn't look like before, that I wasn't interested in being managed, measured, or pressured, that I wouldn't operate inside deadlines designed to test my usefulness. I said if there was anything left between us, it would exist without clocks, without threats, without spectators. She nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She finally understood the cost of the game she'd chosen to play. That evening, I packed lightly. No announcement, no speech, just the things that belonged to me. When I reached the door, she stood behind me, silent. I paused once, turned slightly, and said the only thing that needed to be said. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. Then I left, not to punish her, not to teach her anything, but because walking away without noise was the only decision that had never required a deadline. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.